Okay, this is it. This is the last lecture for our course for this semester. Before we end, I want to tell you a couple of announcements and then we'll jump into the lecture. So we'll have some announcements first and then lecture. I'm going to talk about how to think about culture and social change, the difference between endogenous and exogenous processes and explanations, some so-called major change processes that we'll raise our eyebrows to and think about, and then finally some breaks or barriers that prevent change from occurring that a lot of times social scientists think should be occurring or most definitely will occur. The general theme for this lecture is really kind of casting doubt on broad claims about cultural change, but then also looking at some great examples, these two readings for this week, about how to get into some of the processes about to look at social change that may, or as one article says, may not be occurring. A couple of announcements first. Your final paper, it's only 5 pages. I spelled out the instructions for you, A, to make it easier to write, but B, also to focus your thinking so that you don't spend a lot of time kind of with puffery, but actually get to the main parts of the paper. If you have questions about the paper, email me well in advance. Don't email me the night before. And I will post any responses I give to questions on the blog on D2L. If you do have questions, like I said, try and get them in at least 48 hours before the deadline is due. And the deadline, by the way, is midnight on that Friday, so I've given you a little extra time. But don't waste a Friday night writing a paper. Why not be done by 5 and celebrate the end of the semester? Or, as many of you know, give yourself time to prepare for other exams. So get that paper done. So this is our last lecture. It's been an absolutely enjoyable semester for me. Like many of you, I am actually graduating in a couple of weeks. I'm actually going to drive on back to Arizona, enjoy the heat for a few days, and celebrate. So those of you who are graduating, congratulations. Those of you who aren't graduating yet, keep with it. If you have any questions or anything for me about the class or grades or anything like that, make sure to get in touch with me in these next 2 weeks so we can get all that taken care of. Of course, best of luck in whatever you do from here. Hopefully this class has given you a few new ways of seeing the world. So on this first topic we have here about culture and social change, I want to just speak real broadly for a moment. First thing, when we think about change in society and culture at all, we want to think of social life as fundamentally dynamic. There could be a tendency when we read a sociology book or sociology article or hear some statistics on the news to think cross-sectionally. And the problem with thinking cross-sectionally is that cross-section means kind of a slice in time that you can pull out and look at. So if you think of cutting a tree, trees falling in the forest, you cut it in half and you pull out a slice and you just kind of look, you maybe just look at a part of that slice. That can be one of the problems of thinking about social change, is to just look at the features of society at that exact moment and think that everything is logically related and it is the way it's supposed to be. Well, we want to push back against that a little bit and look actually kind of across time, what's called diachronic, or in familiar sociological language, we want to look longitudinally. That's the best way to see A, if change is actually occurring, and B, the even more important question, why change is occurring. So the dynamism of any society, or the changing of any society, varies a lot. So we know that social life is dynamic and changes, but whether one given social group or one given society or one given nation or one historical epoch changes depends on a number of variables. For example, geographic location. Isolated places tend to have less social change occurring. Whether or not material or kind of the economic bases of reality is shifting will affect social change. Outside connections to networks. So whether you or the community you live in has a lot of connections to kind of new ideas or foreign places has a lot to do with how much your community will change. And then finally, human agency. So this is kind of a question that's floated in the background in a lot of our course. But there are some conditions that enable kind of expression of a full range of creative responses of human agency, and there are conditions that suppress that. So my quick point here is just that as we think about social change, be aware that there's lots of variability to whether social change, or to how quickly or how dramatic social change is occurring. Now, a main problem in thinking about social change, particularly in the modern Western world, which would be really the last 200 years of Western Europe in the United States, is we've often thought about linear social change. In other words, if you think back to Durkheim, this is a good example. Durkheim would talk about those primitive Australian tribes, right? And in Durkheim's viewpoint, and a lot of earlier sociologists, the idea was, okay, you kind of got primitive, and there will be, according to these early sociologists, and even sociologists throughout a lot of the 20th century, some sort of linear linear trajectory of change. Now, the rate of change might vary a little bit, so it could be kind of a lower slope, hence a lower rate, or it could even be even more lower slope, or it could be a really high slope. But the whole idea behind a lot of Western thinkers was that there was a linearity to change. In other words, society is on track of heading towards this thing we call modern. There's no getting off that track. The track is definitely happening. And these were based on some, pretty dominant ideas. We can look back and critique and go, ha ha, that's funny. Boy, these guys, and they were mostly guys, these thinkers, they weren't able to think of the fall of the Soviet Union, or they weren't able to think of 9/11 terrorist attacks, or the Arab Revolution, and the Arab Spring of the last 18 months. These people were just poor thinkers. Well, we don't want to be so critical of them, because they were actually thinkers of their moment, thinkers of their context, and there were some really strong ideas in that context. One, and this isn't a bad word at all, but idea of progress was fundamental to the vision in the late 1800s and early 1900s, the vision of politicians, of thinkers, of social scientists, even of natural scientists. And so it was embodying this idea of progress is the ability of human reason to discover natural laws that are universal for all time, and by this discovery, the use of reason, to free ourselves from the shackles of whatever is problematic in the world, and to put ourselves on this linear path of becoming better, of progressing. And while that's a rather incredible and actually admirable vision of maybe what a future should be like, the idea that there was some kind of natural propensity and that this was going to happen has turned out not to be true. So this is not to say we're not progressing and things could not get better in aspects of our lives and worlds, but the idea that this is any sort of natural, perfect trajectory that's going to happen is not true. Instead, there's lots of what we call contingency. So there's lots of things that happen that shift the nature of various processes of change in actual real time. So there is notions of progress kind of based on reason, but then there's also been notions of kind of I guess we could call it, I don't want to be pejorative here, I definitely don't want to be pejorative here, but kind of there's also teleological visions that are religious. So you can have reason-based visions of linearity of social change, but you can also kind of have religious-based visions that are teleological. In other words, that there's some point out here in the future at which human society, if it would only become aware of kind of God's plan or only discover the divine potential in ourselves, we can, without a doubt, reach that final point. And this has both kind of really great kind of ethical implications as well as bizarre implications. So we can think of Martin Luther King's wonderful phrase that the moral arc of the universe bends towards justice. That phrase was inspiring for civil rights activists in the 1950s and 1960s to think about, yes, there is some better vision out there that we can get to. So this teleological vision. Now, as we discovered, it's certainly possible to get to a better vision of the world and to actually make that vision happen. But the idea that that's naturally out there, just there, and if we sit around, it's going to happen, that's a whole other question altogether, because without the civil rights movement, right, that movement that, and at one level self-generated from, especially from a black community movement, we never even get to that final goal. So you can see these visions are useful in terms of helping a society move, but they're not descriptive in saying that that movement will certainly happen naturally, just given enough time. And let me give one more, what I think is kind of a strange teleological vision, and that is with the absolute fetish around this whole idea of a Mayan end times prophecy. If you scratch the surface at all, if you read deeply, and I think PBS had a good episode on this recently, you realize that this idea of a Mayan end time prophecy is really based in the discovery or rediscovery of some very minor and very kind of fuzzy Mayan writings that have been known for quite some time, but the rediscovery recently of kind of some New Age spiritual gurus and some kind of end times sorts of people that want to read into this and say we've lost some sort of ancient ability to know the true purpose of the universe. So even in these strange kind of Mayan end times sort of visions, you can still have lurking behind it this idea of linearity, like there's this plan in the universe that's always been there. It's going to happen. We're going to reach some different point. So I'm trying to say we're moving away from explanations that are so linear and determined like that. Determined in the sense, sociological sense of it's going to happen. So the trick for sociologists is that we often spend a lot of our times asking questions of why things don't change. So you could understand the Kahn book that we read as really a big attempt to understand why the heck is equality or inequality still around? Why the heck is equality not happening? So the trick for sociologists is to try and break out of these large overarching visions, instead to try and first ask questions of, are things changing? And then secondly, how do we explain those changes? So in doing so, we're against both broad statements like this, as well as simple statements. There's a rash. You can pick up LA Times, Washington Post, New York Times, whatever you want, and there's always study after study after study coming out saying things like obesity is caused by ... or evolution makes people date or eat or act in such and such a way. These are really kind of simplistic explanations that, while they may have latched on in a scientific way, there's some real potential causality between certain evolutionary processes in behavior or certain behaviors in social contexts. They purport to try and explain in some really broad, definitive way. Whereas we know if we just sit around long enough, there'll be another study that rebutes that or another study that specifies that. And so as we think about social change and culture, we want to kind of be, I guess, prudent and restrained and aware of both kind of grand statements as well as aware of simple statements to kind of cover over the complexity of reality. So I'll be right back to talk about this, what I mean by endogenous and exogenous reasons.